Welcome to Infidelity Stories. Please like this video and subscribe. We're grateful for each and every one of you. We'd love to hear from you in the comments. Let's begin. I pleaded with him to keep going until he had fully filled me. I'm not sure if anyone else can recall the way fear clings to your gut, like something living and presses into your ribs as children do. However, I do. The home felt smaller than ever, especially on that one summer night when the sky broke open, and it seemed as though the walls were straining to contain whatever storm had chosen to rest on the roof. I was 10 years old at the time, still impressionable enough to assume that adults could influence the weather in some way, and still innocent enough to think that comfort might be as simple as calling someone's name in the dark. I didn't think he would enter. Then no. Really never. However, he did. Silently. Not by knocking. With the same steady hand that he used for everything else, he simply opened the door, gave me a little look as if he wasn't sure whether to say anything, then, without saying a word, crossed the room and slid himself onto the edge of the bed, like someone setting down a heavy coat next to a fire. He didn't inquire about my well-being. He didn't assure me that the storm will pass, and he didn't do anything that I believe people should do in similar situations. He simply laid next to me, anchoring the room with deep, calm breathing. I recall thinking at the time that it seemed safe, that as long as he was there, nothing could get to me, and that perhaps if we both remained motionless long enough, the universe might keep itself together. Years later, though, I can't help but experience the warmth of that moment a bit differently every time that recollection resurfaces in my mind, always when I least expect it to. It's closer to something I can't quite put my finger on, but not darker or quite wrong. Something too keen for a dream, too ancient for a child. I'm 24 years old now, older in ways that have nothing to do with years, and I ended up back here in the house I left behind nearly 6 years ago, in the room that doesn't smell like me anymore and hasn't for a long time, after breaking my leg in what I still tell people was a bad fall, though it was really just me misjudging a step in a parking lot and trying to pretend I wasn't in pain until the swelling forced the truth out. I accepted without giving it much thought because I had nowhere else to go and Mom volunteered to help while I recovered, saying I could stay as long as I needed to. What surprised me was how the hospital's night shifts lasted until dawn, and how I ended up alone downstairs while he went through the kitchen as if nothing had changed, as if I was not there with my crutches and my stubborn silence, acting as though I didn't notice how we kept going around the same rooms without saying anything, without making eye contact for too long, and without breaking whatever quiet rhythm we had established as if it were some kind of unwritten agreement. He's cautious, but he's never been nasty. The kind of careful that gives you the impression that every move has already been considered and measured, as if he's still trying to be just present enough. This balance is more unsettling than anything else because it indicates that he sees me, truly sees me, and still decides to stay behind that invisible line that we both act doesn't exist, even when we're only a few feet apart in a hallway that feels suddenly too small. However, the weather has changed once more tonight, and I could feel something tighten in my chest from the first distant thunderclap. It was as if my body was recalling something that my brain had not yet fully processed, as if there was a part of me that had never unlearned what it meant to wait for footsteps in the hallway or to brace for a storm. As I sat down on the couch with my leg propped up and my blanket pulled over me, I noticed the trees bending against the night outside the kitchen window. During supper, the lights flickered and then remained steady. The room went dark, completely, abruptly, without warning, and the silence that followed was heavier than it should have been, as if even the house was listening. I tried to concentrate on the show that was playing in front of me, letting the scripted laughter and predictable dialogue fill the space where my thoughts were beginning to circle. For a moment I sat motionless, allowing my eyes to adjust, listening to my own heartbeat, and keeping track of the seconds that had passed since the power went out. A flashlight beam briefly touched the edge of the ceiling before traveling over the floor after I called his name softly enough to disturb the silence. A few seconds later, I heard steady, slow footsteps coming from the corridor. I didn't trust my voice, didn't trust myself to say anything that wouldn't sound more than it was, so I nodded when he asked if I was okay. He entered the room with his flashlight kept low, and for a time we simply stared at each other, silent and motionless. I watched him from where I sat, unable to stop myself from following the outline of his movements as if they might explain something I didn't understand. He went into the kitchen, rummaged through the drawers, still the third one to the left of the sink, still full of those mismatched lighters and old takeout menus, found the candles, lit one and placed it on the counter. as if the way he struck the match concealed the answer to a question I hadn't posed. He eventually brought me a cup of tea, placed it next to me, and explained that it was chamomile. Is it still your favorite? Even though my hands trembled more than they should have when I took the mug, I was still able to thank you. However, the heat from the cup did nothing to stop whatever had begun to flash beneath my ribs. After that, we sat quietly. He was seated in the armchair. I was wrapped in the same blanket I had used to sleep with as a child, and the candle was creating shadows on the ceiling that seemed to move with the air. Perhaps the storm was the cause. Perhaps it was the flash of recollection. Perhaps it was simply the pressure of being seen by someone who recalls your true self before you mastered the art of pretending. However, I couldn't help but wonder if he recalled that evening. The one I was 10 years old. The one who could split the planet with his thunder. The one where he lay next to me and said nothing. He simply nodded without glancing at me. Yes, I said. Stated that he believed I required a presence to help me maintain my composure. Claimed that at the time it felt like the appropriate decision. I had no idea what I was anticipating from him. I had no idea why I had asked. But what if that moment was never as straightforward as I believed it to be? I pondered as we sat there with the candle between us and the wind rattling the windows. What if I've been carrying something about for years that I've never wanted to publicly mention? Something that has been hovering in the background, waiting for a storm like this to bring it to the surface again. Although it was quiet, the room was not serene. Not at all. And I sensed it moving once again somewhere under my ribcage. Breathing in the dark, that old recollection. After a blackout, the quiet isn't truly quiet. Not while the home continues to creak as if recalling its age. Not with the rain hammering steadily like tiny fists on the glass. Not when every breath you take sounds so loud that it seems like it would burst the air. And while I sat there on the couch, my leg hurting from the weight of 2 blankets, I became aware of how much noise we typically ignore until it all goes away at once. No heater was turning on. The refrigerator is not humming. The internet router in the corner is not blinking. Which strangely gave me more anxiety than the actual darkness. There are no TVs from distant neighbors escaping through weak walls. It was just the candle on the coffee table, and each time the draft caught it, it let out little hisses. And the steady, lengthy trickle of water from the outside gutters. I spent several minutes sitting there. Perhaps longer. I tried to convince myself that the darkness would pass. I'm trying to keep my throat from feeling every heartbeat. When I once more heard his footsteps. Rubber soles scraping slowly against wood. Then it slid down the distant wall, the dim arc of flashlight beam catching the ceiling. At first he remained silent. Came over just now. Extended a hand. Hands up. His fingers were slack as if he were giving me an option, and I grabbed on without even thinking. Before my intellect caught up, my fingers curled into his as if they recalled his shape. Breathing became more difficult as the heat from his skin buzzed up my arm. He carefully assisted me in getting up. My elbow was touched by one hand. The other was supporting the crutch beneath my arm on the other side. I moved as if I already knew where all of my vulnerabilities were. Most likely he did. We then made our way to the kitchen. Awkward, slow steps that were too noisy in the open area. In jerky tiny arcs, the flashlight bounced in front of us, creating swift, long shadows on the walls. And I became aware that our breathing was nearly in time. He breathed deeply and slowly. Mine is shallow enough and faster to produce my spotlight. And when his arm unintentionally touched mine, or perhaps not, I tensed up so much that he looked at me, concerned. However, I simply shook my head and continued. He released me in the kitchen long enough to reach into the cupboard and retrieve a glass. The second shelf still. Notwithstanding the passage of time. The tap water here tasted like metal, so we filled it from the water bottle we always kept on the counter. His fingertips touched mine one more as he gave me the glass. This time lighter. It's almost a query. And the warm, stuffy air that was trapped in the house after hours without circulation had nothing to do with the heat that rushed through me. To buy myself a moment, I took a slow drink. Gazed at the candle flame that seemed to be trying to get out by bending toward the window. And when he subtly inquired as to whether I needed anything else, I gave a headshake. My voice was still stuck in that tight spot between my throat and my ribs. For quite a while, we only stood there. Just a couple of feet apart. Like a hand on the back of my neck, the darkness is pressing in. And I sensed a hum in the space between us. Right, wrong, and electric all at once. He eventually turned his back. He fiddled with the lighters in the rubbish drawer as if he was trying to find a better one. They all performed the same tasks. And I made an effort not to notice how his shoulders shifted beneath the baggy old sweatshirt he wore on these kinds of evenings. When I turned back to the living room, the crutch slipped slightly. And before I was able to stop myself, he was present. I keep my hand steady at my waist. Not very tight. Not shoving. Just enough to keep me standing. It was just enough to give me a chest ache for reasons unrelated to balance. We retreated to the couch as if nothing had occurred. As if neither of us had frozen for too long. And with a sort of stiffness that had not existed before, he sank back into the chair. And as if to block off the memory of his hand hovering at my waist, I drew the blanket tighter about my shoulders and concentrated on the candle flame. Eventually, minutes perhaps, hours perhaps, before I could stop myself, the words escaped my lips. Stupid, timid, and soft. Inquiring as to whether he recalled the storm from years ago. I couldn't sleep on that one. The one where he silently entered my room. He answered without glancing at me. Just answered yeah while gazing at the candle's pool of light. He recalled. Stated that he believed it might be beneficial. Sometimes it was more important to simply be there than to say anything. Perhaps it did. Perhaps it does. I detested hearing it though because there was a break in the borders of his voice. I wanted to respond with something. I wanted to assure him things was all right. That my neck wouldn't open, but it was nothing else. And my chest began to sag more heavily. Like a hand unsure of whether to crush or comfort, it pressed down. Once more, the candle broke. And everything felt too sharp for a moment. Too intelligent. Too near. As if the world had challenged us to move by folding itself into the small gap between us. He was the first to stand. With the beam bobbling low to the floor, she vanished down the hall while muttering something about checking the windows upstairs. And as if it were the only thing holding me to the floor, I sat there gripping the half-empty glass. I pushed myself to stand when I could no longer hear his footsteps. Going slowly. Uncomfortably, one crutch jammed beneath my arm. For balance, the other hand is holding onto the wall. I then headed for the stairs. Despite the fact that every bone in my body begged to remain in place. Must act as though none of this was taking place. It was a slow ascent. Awkward. Unpleasant. And I just stood there for a moment after I eventually made it to the top. Taking deep breaths in the dark. Like a mouth ready to shut, the entire upstairs spread out in front of me. Then he emerged from the guest room. Low flashlight. And across the slender corridor our gazes met. And neither of us moved for one foolish, panting moment. We both remained silent. The entire house held its breath alongside us. He took a stride in my direction. Slow. Measured. A hand hovered close to my arm as if to offer assistance without pressuring. And without saying a word, he led me the final few feet to my room after I nodded. Only constant pressure and the intolerable heat of his body near me. He assisted me in sitting on the bed's edge inside the room. With a gentleness that shattered something tiny and sharp inside me, it assisted me in swinging my leg up onto the mattress. Like he was tucking in a toddler too little to do it himself, he pulled the blanket up about my shoulders. His hand hovered over my shoulder for an excessive amount of time. Warm through my shirt's material. Steady in the sense that something that tasted almost like anguish made my throat tighten. Like hunger, almost. I didn't express gratitude. I said absolutely nothing. I simply gazed up at him. Silent and wide-eyed. And he turned around. Dark eyes in the light of the candles. His lips were clenched as if he were suppressing every word that none of us dared to say. He remained where he was. Nor did I. There was a single flicker of the candle. Twice. And left. It didn't feel like a new day at all the morning following the storm. Not when the air was still clinging to the walls too tightly. Not when the sky was gloomy and the windows were sweating. Not when the house itself sounded as though it was holding its breath in between floorboard creaks. The power had returned. The lights are flickering. The refrigerator hummed as if nothing had occurred. The air hadn't cleared though for some reason. The weight from the previous night had, for some reason, crept into the house's bones and remained there like uncleanable dust. I spent more time upstairs than was necessary. Dragging out the little things like dressing. And brushing my hair. Pretending that every time I moved, my leg didn't hurt. Because I felt like I was stepping back into something I wasn't yet ready to name when I went downstairs. I wasn't even certain that I could hide it. He was standing by the sink when I eventually limped into the kitchen. Cleaning a coffee cup that didn't appear to be filthy. He moved slowly and robotically as if he needed to use his hands. And our exchange of glances was too quick when he looked up. Too cautious. Similar to feeling a bruise you'd rather not acknowledge exists. Mom remained at her job. Her nights always lasted into the gloomy early hours. The two of us were then once more suspended in this weird, oppressive silence. Against the dense silence, every chair movement or dish clink sounds twice as loud. I walked over to the table. I pretended not to notice that when I went too close, he moved a little away. I pretended not to notice that the effort required to maintain my casualness caused my own body to tense. To maintain even breathing. All morning, the thought of asking him to help me go to the shower had been brewing in the back of my mind. Unpleasant and stinging. Since I was aware that there was no other choice. Not like this with my leg. Nevertheless, the words remained lodged in my throat like burrs. It's sharp and hard to spit out. It took longer than necessary. Finally, though, I didn't want to drink half a glass of water. I pretended to check the weather on my phone, despite the fact that the screen was only a blur. I asked, clearing my throat. Attempting to sound informal. I tried to make it seem like it wasn't the worst thing I'd ever thought of. He took a while to respond. He merely gazed at me. Unreadable expression. After that, placed the mug on the counter too carefully. Like he was attempting to erase something, he wiped his hands on the front of his pants. And in a voice coarser than the one he'd been using all morning, he said sure. It was a slow walk upstairs. Uncomfortable. Each step was measured as if we were attempting to avoid tripping over invisible lines that weren't present the day before. And I paused when we got to the restroom door. Longer than necessary hand lying on the frame. Rabbiting under my skin with a pulse. Unremarking, he opened the door. Moved aside to make room for me first. And I saw a reflection of myself in the mirror as soon as I stepped through the door. The hair was twisted. Face too pale. Too big of eyes. And something twisted low in my stomach like a lightning. As he switched on the water, steam immediately filled the room. When I was younger and detested cold showers, he would always set the temperature in this manner. Without requesting. Without having to inquire. And for some reason, that little motion tightened my throat more than anything else had up until that point. I had trouble putting on my sweatshirt. Clumsy fingers. My elbow is being caught by the fabric. And he instinctively caught me when I staggered forward after losing my footing a little. With one hand gripping my arm just below the shoulder. The other gripped my waist firmly. We froze like that for a heartbeat. He was close enough for me to feel his flesh heat through my t-shirt. Could detect the subtle, fresh scent of soap stuck to his collar. And he stepped back as though burnt, although dropping his hands instantly. His imprint remained. Like an echo, it pulsed against my rib cage. I entered the shower stall without turning around, pulling the barrier between us closed. He then turned away. One hand is braced on the doorframe. His breathing was so controlled and steady that it seemed almost like an order to himself. Water splashed up my back. It was hot enough to sting, but my chest was thumping so hard that it hardly registered. Over the knowledge that he was only a few feet away was the gap. Only a small piece of plastic separated us, and we both managed to hold on to whatever control we had. I muttered a curse as I realized I had forgotten to keep the towel close at hand, silently yet not sufficiently silent, and demanded that he give me one. I'm trying to speak steadily, attempting to act as though this was still typical. For a moment he fumbled, hands awkward where they weren't. I reached for the towel when he eventually pulled it through the curtain's opening. Not found. Before I could pull it back, my hand brushed his wrist and then moved over the side of his neck. Like a live wire, the contact jolted through us both. My fingertips burned where they had touched the sensitive area just under his jaw, and I froze. And our faces were inches apart as he looked up. Steam around us like a tightening noose. Neither of us took the lead. Or perhaps we did it simultaneously. To be honest, I have no idea. Abruptly, though, his lips found mine. Real tough and desperate. It wasn't sweet either. Wasn't cautious. The awful, magnificent release of something we'd both been acting didn't exist was all there was heat and tension. The kiss ended nearly as quickly as it began, and we staggered backwards, breathing into the dense air as if we had been pushed apart. Like people who have witnessed something they weren't supposed to live, we were both stunned and wide-eyed. This is a mistake, I muttered as I tightened my hold on the towel to my chest, trembling so much that my knees almost buckled. Despite the fact that the words were bland, even though I wasn't entirely sure if I meant what I was saying, or if I was just aware that I had to say it. He didn't respond. He merely gazed at me. truly took a look at me. He went out, letting the door swing between us with a soft finality that hit harder than any slammed door ever could have, then turned on his heel with a rawness that made my stomach turn. After he departed, I stayed there for a while, towel clutched like armor, water cooling on my skin, and gazing at the spot where he had been. At the specter looming large in the air of something we couldn't take back. Perhaps God, could that have happened? Long before last night it had begun. Long before this morning. Like mold in the walls, it grows slowly and silently. Until it was too late, neither of us wanted to witness it. And I was certain of one thing now, that things had broken open between us. The previous state of affairs could never be restored. Just before midnight, I made my sluggish approach to the restroom, one crutch beneath my arm and the other hand following the wall of the corridor. Touching something substantial kept me grounded in a house that was beginning to feel less and less like a home. Not because I really needed the support. The borders of the mirror above the sink were still foggy from earlier, as though even it didn't want to represent what had been happening between us over the last few days. Its surface seemed hazy and lifeless, and the look in my own eyes felt like a question I had no right to answer, so I was unable to look at it for longer than a few seconds. The overhead lights had already been switched out when I returned to the living room, and the only light left was the gentle amber glow from the corner lamp casting languid, uneven shadows on the floor. The space was quieter and more intimate than it had ever felt. When he spotted me, he got up. Not suddenly. He spoke with the same quiet firmness that I had grown to identify with him over the years, but not in a way that implied surprise or remorse. He immediately inquired if I needed assistance getting settled for the night. Despite the fact that I felt uneasy inside, I told him I didn't. He waited until I had the pillow perfectly positioned beneath my leg, until I had drawn the blanket over me in a single, deliberate motion that seemed more ceremonial than a useful gesture of comfort, and when I finally let out a breath, as though I had accomplished something significant. His stance remained neutral as he went for the remote control, lowered the television's level to a low murmur, and sat back in his normal chair. The screen was not watched by us. We didn't talk. Nevertheless, it didn't feel empty or serene when we were silent. I could feel his eyes moving toward me in quick, deliberate glances that he likely assumed I wouldn't notice. It felt like static gathering in the corners of the room, like a current humming beneath the floorboards. However, I did see them. In the same way that I observed how his respiration changed somewhat as I changed mine. Or how, as if to remind himself to remain still, he now sat with his hands resting on his knees every time. Every time our eyes came close to meeting, I automatically looked away. A crease in the blanket, a corner of the table, or the plush rug fringe. Anything to prevent the excruciating strain that I knew would arise if I allowed the touch to remain in place for even a single second. Even for something as little as, "Would you like some tea?" His voice always disturbed the stillness. Or, "What is the current state of your leg?" My entire body seemed to be being asked a question that I was unable to articulate verbally, and I felt a tight tug inside my chest. During the day, he once crossed behind me to repair the curtain that had fallen off its hook. His hand also softly touched my shoulder as he went by, just enough to register as warmth, not consciously nor firmly, and I flinched unintentionally when a tremor sprang so abruptly from the base of my spine. He didn't say anything, but he paused for a half-second, perhaps long enough to see my reaction. Continued. Didn't say anything. Simply continued across the room and readjusting the curtain as if nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. My phone then lit up on the armrest next to me once more, as though the house itself had decided I couldn't stand it any longer. Mom had left the message. It uttered just 4 words, all basic and straightforward. "I adore you. I'm still here." I spent more time looking at the screen than I should have. Those words seemed to belong to a different version of the night that hadn't quite caught up with this one. Not because I wasn't sure how to respond. With my fingers shaking a little, I scribbled a hesitant reply, advising her to be careful, to try to get some rest if she could, and to check in again later when she had her phone face down so that I wouldn't be distracted by its glow. However, the issue of distraction had been resolved, because a man who hadn't spoken more than a dozen words all evening was sitting in the same old recliner opposite from me. Nevertheless, his presence was louder than any sound the TV could have produced. As I moved slightly under the blanket and felt the weight of his eyes fall on me once more without looking, it struck me with horrifying clarity that I was holding out, not waiting for a reply SMS from Mom, not awaiting the conclusion of the news report. I'm not waiting for sleep to finally take me under or for the agony in my leg to go away. I waited for the room's final light to go out, and I knew when that happened, I couldn't lie to myself about what was already happening any longer. The storm returned with a vengeance, louder than the last one, and slammed into the home with such intensity that the old pipes rumbled somewhere deep in the walls and the window frames shook. And even though I was asleep when it began, the sound of thunder crashing just above the roof and the sharp pain in my leg jolted me awake so quickly that I briefly lost my sense of location. There was no lighting from the plugs or blinking lights from the router, and the room was completely dark. The only sound was the storm's heaving pressure, as if it wanted to enter the house, and I frantically grabbed for my phone. I found it dead in my hand and worthless, then lay there for an excessive amount of time. My breath was shallow, my heart was pounding, and I could feel the pain shooting up from my knee till it seemed like the entire bed was vibrating beneath me. I shouted for him without even considering it, without preparing the sound of my voice. Not too loud, nearly a murmur. However, even a whisper seemed to reach too far in a house that was deafened by wind and rain. I waited, praying that my voice hadn't been completely drowned out by the commotion. A long minute went by, long enough for panic to tighten in my chest and for doubt to seep in, when I noticed a slender, shaky beam of light stumbling over the corridor, followed by the gradual, gentle creak of my door opening. He was barefoot, with his hair in a mustache, a hoodie slung over his shoulders, and a flashlight that was quivering slightly in his palm as if the storm had also entered him. The mattress dipped softly under his weight as he sat down at the edge of the bed, close enough for me to see how his other hand hovered, uncertain, before finally finding my pillow and adjusting it beneath my leg with a tenderness that made my throat tighten painfully. He moved across the room without saying a word, his steps deliberate and cautious. It ached more tonight, I told him. Not the leg alone, but everything. The shadows, the wind. Every time there was a thunderclap, the house seemed to get smaller around me. I let my head rest against his shoulder without asking if he was okay, without thinking about anything other than the fact that, for the first time that night, the room didn't feel quite so oppressive, as he drew nearer and offered the kind of silent assurance that didn't require words. We sat like that for a long time, breathing together, his hand slowly lifting to my hair, and then gently brushing it back behind my ear, an emotion so delicate it nearly didn't feel real. The only sounds were the storm's distant roar and my uncontrollably quiet, quivering breath. He remained motionless for so long that I hoped it would be sufficient. Perhaps there could be this one tiny act of kindness without leading to danger. Then he said, "I can't do it anymore," in a voice so low it hardly touched the distance between us. Couldn't continue acting like that. He felt like he was going to go crazy if he continued to pass me in the corridor or sit across the table. "I don't know how to stop wanting me," he said. He claimed that he no longer had the strength to ignore it, and I ought to have retreated. Before it could gain legs, I ought to have said something to stop the moment in its tracks. Instead, though, I turned to face him, my cheek grazing his sweater. And somewhere deep and silent inside of me, the choice had already been made as my hand touched the side of his face and my fingers grazed the edge of his jaw. He made no hesitation. Didn't think twice. With a single breath, he closed the distance between us. And he didn't kiss me in a desperate manner. Wasn't desperate. It was heavy, slow, and unavoidable. It's the kiss that feels more like an admission than an invitation. The kind where all the answers are already inscribed on your flesh, leaving no space for inquiries. Around us, the house moaned under the might of the wind, the walls trembling softly as if they were barely able to support themselves. And we let go of all our justifications, defenses, and promises to other people in that brief interval between heartbeats and thunderclaps. It was as if the storm outside had drowned out the normal rules of the universe, leaving just this touch, breath, and the heat of a decision made too late to undo. Everything that followed unfolded with a kind of fragile intensity, movements languid and muted. There was nothing hasty or careless about it, and perhaps that was the worsening factor. The fact that neither of us stopped despite being acutely aware of what we were doing. Something heavier than electricity seemed to be humming in the air against our flesh. I also thought I heard the floorboards creak in warning someplace deep inside the home, as if even the foundation knew it couldn't withstand another blow like this. Then there was the crisp clatter of keys striking the front door, breaking the dense, hot silence. It all froze. The room became so tense that it was burning. My heart was pounding so loudly that I was certain it would give us away as I pulled up on my elbows, my breath stopping cruelly in my chest. And he sat stiffly next to me, his muscles clenched, his eyes wide with the unbreakable horror. All we could hear was the creaking sound of the door opening, the hinges groaning beneath the weight of what was about to be delivered. She called my name in that careless manner that people do when they are already halfway to putting down their keys and taking off their shoes, and her voice drifted in, casual and exhausted, with a silent urgency that made my stomach turn. He clambered from the bed first, shifting up over me as if hiding the evidence would somehow make it go away. And with a slow, purposeful push, the door to my bedroom swung inward, and he was halfway across the room. The air between us was thick and broken, and my mother's eyes instantly locked onto the scene in front of her, me lying flushed and stunned in a tangled bed, while she stood framed in the doorway, her hair damp from the mist, her jacket still slipping off her shoulders, and her hand frozen on the knob. Every silent confession, secret phrase, and denial I had been planning without even realizing it would be revealed by the expression in her eyes. She then took a step back, closed the door with a quiet, reverberating click, and left down the corridor, her footsteps fading away one cautious, crushing step at a time, with a poise I could never have imagined. The ensuing silence was worse than any storm, thunderclap, or lightning strike because it was the sound of something essential shattering cleanly in two, something that would never, ever be reassembled. The following morning did not erupt in a flurry of drama or crumble under the weight of one awful epiphany. When I opened my eyes, the air around me felt too still, too cautious, as if it already knew that something essential had been broken while the walls politely pretended not to notice. It just unfolded slowly, like an old bruise spreading under thin skin, leaving everything looking almost exactly the same as before, but somehow stripped of every quiet comfort that had once made this house feel like home. Sometime before dawn, the rain had stopped, and in its place, there was only a gentle mist curling at the windows, transforming the morning light into something pale and muted. This mist touched every surface of the house with a gentleness that made my skin itch under the covers. As I lay there, motionless under the blanket, I realized that I was afraid to move, afraid that even a slight movement would break the delicate agreement that held this silence together. I could hear my mother walking around the kitchen downstairs, her slow, deliberate steps, the clink of a mug against the countertop sharp enough to make me cringe even from 2 floors away. There was something about the way she moved, the unhurried carelessness of it, that made me almost certain she hadn't slept at all, that she had spent the night pacing or staring at a ceiling like I had, breathing the same heavy air filled with everything we now knew and couldn't say. I stayed upstairs longer than usual, telling myself it was because I had a leg ache, or the stairs were difficult, but deep down I knew that wasn't the real reason, that the true reason was rooted somewhere much uglier, somewhere in the part of me that still couldn't decide whether it was safer to hide or face the wreckage I had helped create. When I finally made my way down, crutches awkward under my arms, each step measured and slow, I found her exactly where I expected, standing by the stove, back turned, shoulders drawn up tight beneath her robe, her hair pulled into a rough knot that looked like it had been done with trembling hands, and when she heard me enter, she didn't turn around, didn't greet me with the soft, tired smile she usually saved for mornings after her night shifts, but instead just murmured a neutral "Good morning" into the empty space between us. I answered back, voice thin and small in my own ears, and moved to the chair furthest from hers, lowering myself into it with more care than I probably needed, hyper-aware of how loudly the crutches clattered against the table leg as I tried to arrange them out of the way. The kitchen smelled faintly of coffee, but the rich, grounding scent that usually made this room feel like the heart of the house now seemed thin and artificial, as if someone had sprayed a memory of coffee into the air and hoped it would be enough to fool us both. And I wrapped my hands around the mug she had set down for me without comment, feeling the steam prickle against my skin without offering any real warmth. She didn't ask how I slept, I didn't ask her how her shift had gone. We just sat there, 2 people who had spent the night on opposite sides of a shattering, pretending not to notice the broken edges scattered across the table between us. I could feel the words sitting heavy in my chest, pressing against my ribs with every breath, but every time I thought about speaking, about apologizing, about trying to explain the unexplainable, my throat closed tighter, as if even my body refused to let me lie by pretending there was anything left to salvage. After a while she said she needed to go out for a few hours, errands to run, paperwork to handle at the clinic, appointments she couldn't reschedule, and even though the list sounded rehearsed, like it was designed more for her own benefit than for mine, I nodded without argument, grateful for the space, even if the gratitude tasted like rust at the back of my tongue. When she left, the house didn't sigh or relax the way it sometimes did after a long night. It simply held its breath a little longer, tightening around me like a fist. I moved through the rooms in slow circles, picking up objects I didn't need, smoothing already flat blankets, wiping spotless counters, all the while feeling like an intruder in a life I had no right to inhabit anymore, and every creak of the floorboards under my feet sounded less like a home settling and more like a warning, like the house itself wanted me gone. When I passed by the front window I caught my reflection in the glass, pale, drawn, eyes too wide and dark, and for one strange disorienting second I didn't recognize myself, didn't see the girl who used to laugh at bad sitcoms with her mother on this very couch. Didn't see the careful daughter who used to organize surprise birthday dinners and leave sticky notes of encouragement on the fridge, but only someone hollowed out, someone stitched together from choices she didn't even want to name aloud. I tried to make tea, thinking maybe the ritual of it would anchor me, would make the kitchen feel less like a stage after the audience had left, but even the smell of mint rising from the mug felt thin and insufficient, and I abandoned it after one sip, walking instead to the back door where the mist had thickened into something heavier. Something that pressed against the glass with soft, steady persistence. I opened the door slightly, just enough to let the air inside, and immediately regretted it, because the air was too clean, too sharp, carrying none of the weight of last night, none of the ache, and I stood there for a long time, letting it sting my skin, wondering if it was possible to suffocate in air that was too pure to forgive me. He didn't come back. Not that morning, not that afternoon. And the longer the house stayed empty of his footsteps, the heavier the silence became, filling up every corner, every closet, every forgotten drawer, until it felt like the house itself was crumbling from the inside out, its foundation too cracked to stand. Another storm. I sat on the couch by the cold fireplace, the same place where we had laughed during power outages and shared quiet Sunday mornings, and for the first time I noticed how small the room really was. How little space there was to hide from the memory of what we had done, how every shadow looked just a little too much like the outline of something you couldn't unsee once you knew where to look. I thought about calling him, about sending some small message that might make sense of the mess between us, but my hand refused to reach for my phone, and in the end I just sat there, staring at the blank television screen, watching my own hollow reflection stare back. Later, as the light faded and the mist thickened into a cold, wet evening, I wandered upstairs again, pausing in front of the hallway mirror, the one where my mother once adjusted my coat before school, telling me to hold my head high, to be proud, to trust the person I was becoming, but I couldn't lift my chin today. Couldn't meet my own eyes without flinching, because somewhere deep inside, where no excuse could reach, I knew I had crossed a line that love alone could never uncross, and now the only thing left was to stand here in the too clean air of a house that remembered everything, pretending not to notice that the girl my mother had raised had slipped quietly out of sight, leaving someone else behind to bear the silence, and somehow, that silence was louder than any storm.